Okay, we're going to start our marathon. I like marathons, and I certainly like finishing processes. So, particularly in the next 4 days, what we're going to look at in terms of tones and colors, so that we have a foundation laid for the process of beginning to understand how to look at our true design. In other words, how to go below the psychological, analytical level and get down to a level where we're extremely precise. One of the things about moving down in that level is that as you move deeper and deeper down below the level of the line, you're actually getting to chemistry. And chemistry is everything. Chemistry is life. After all, you know my joke, we're just crystals in meat. And it's one of the things to understand is that the meat rules. So the chemistry rules. It's very important to see that what we're going to deal with this weekend and on Monday and Tuesday is that in looking at tone, but particularly when we get to color, you're going to see that all the underlying themes that have been driving you, literally driving you all of your life, haven't even been available to you at the psychological level. In other words, the psychological tradition of trying to find motivation, in other words, trying to find the force that's actually moving you, that force is a chemical force. It's a chemical combination. It's lying beneath the level of the line. And that the moment that you get there, you get to see where your underlying motivation is, not simply in terms of each and every aspect of your design, each and every aspect of every activation that you have, but the overall view of that. In other words, the underlying motivation of your own process in this life. Both of these levels, tone and color, both of them represent this kind of driving force that's there as life. If you could really be in touch with the energy drive operating deep within you, it would be very, 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 very scary. It's all happening faster and more violently than anything we would ever like to think of. There's this incredible speed and force of things that are going on inside of us that have imperatives that are on deadlines that are in microseconds. We're out here in the Maya buzzed out, dealing with the sun and smoke, and there's all this intensity going on inside, and we think we know why we do things, which I always find hilarious. So when we're coming here to the level of tone, what we're starting with is what I call the Department of Planning. This is about as mystical as we can get. It's as mystical as we can get because the joke is that every seeker, and it doesn't matter whether you're seeking through LSD or your favorite guru, that every seeker is looking for that Satori experience or that shock of experience that's going to bring them into what they think is the whole. In other words, their perception or their projection of what they imagine the whole to be. Most of the time, by the way, everybody thinks the whole is up, which I always find amusing. I mean, not that there's any up and down in this biverse of ours, but nonetheless, there's this assumption that it's away from us, that the whole is out there and we have to integrate into the whole. And one of the most remarkable things about finding the whole within yourself, and you can't, by the way, so it's a good joke, that finding the whole within yourself is something inside of you, and it's deep, deep, deep down underneath all the layers that make up the psychological profile of how you function in this life. In other words, when you're at the tone level, this is very different from the bass. Remember that all bass really does is establish your aspect in terms of the perception that you're going to have in this life. That is the particular perception that you're going to have. And your contribution through that perception to maintaining the Maya. But that's very different from what happens at the tone level, because at the tone level you begin to be grouped. In other words, you begin to be coordinated. This is why we have this sense that the whole is somehow attainable to us. Because deep within us, one of the very first things that takes place is that we get grouped, and we get grouped together in a larger function in which we are an aspect of it. my nickname, the Department of Planning for tone. The Department of Planning has 6 departments. Remember that when we're going down in structure, we have 6 variations of a line, 6 variations of a color, 6 variations of a tone, 5 bases. So when you're moving out of the 5 bases will open up into 6 possible tones. Now each and every single one of those tones, as you will see, is the beginning biologically of what we will later call sense. Now, that's very important to understand that the way in which we get organized is that the departments are organized by sense. Now, when I say that, that's the way we can see it from our perspective at the end of the process. In other words, the way we're linked, for example, is that, one department is a nose department, so to speak. In other words, there's all these nosy, I could get nasty, I won't, I'll go into it. I'll save that for later in the week. It's too early. But the thing to understand about that is the way in which we are organized. For example, I'm in the outer vision department. Now, that sounds nice. I mean, it's a nice department, the outer vision department. But after all, if you look at the fact that there are 6 billion of us, these departments are well stocked. So if you imagine that there might be 800 million or 1.2 billion people that belong to the Department of Outer Vision, you have to begin to see that in another context. It's like looking at the structure of the eye and understanding that there are millions and millions and millions of rods that are going to make up that eye. I am a rod. It's something that actually has a mystical touch to it. The rod of Aaron, the source of all magic. The rod in these eyes. Each and every one of those beings that's part of that department is an aspect of that to overall vision. But none of them have access to it. I mean, you don't. You see, the most difficult thing to find in yourself is your tone. At the moment you get to a point in this life where you can live out your type, at the moment that you're truly living out your strategy and you've gone through your cellular process of 7 years, there is always the possibility that you can be in touch with what is tone. Now, it doesn't mean that these things are always very difficult to explain. It's not about you can actively participate in your contribution to the whole in that sense, but you can recognize how you're being positioned, if you will. You can begin to see the way in which you're actually designed to take in information and where your prime source of input is. Now, everything about the structure departmentally, if you will, of these 6 different departments is that these 6 different departments have to be able to communicate with each other. In other words, there is a universal medium, there is a universal sense that acts as the integrating field to the 6 other departments. It's what we call sound. And it's where we begin. When you look at the graph that I will put up, you'll see that the one sense that is not mentioned in this graph is sound. Because sound is the whole thing. The mythology of in the beginning was the Word and so forth and so on. The fact of the matter is that we know from our studies in design that individuality, which is the most sensitive of circuitry to acoustics, that it is individuality that embodies mutative processes within us. That sound is a mutative instrument. The sound of my voice translated through what we call language can become a mutative instrument for you. But sound isn't just a matter of words and isn't just a matter of speech. It isn't just a matter of music. It's about understanding that we live in a frequency field and we ourselves are notes that are part of that frequency. The Global Incarnation Index has a place in which the structure of the Department of Planning is laid out, and it's called the Global Orchestration Directories, the gods. That's their business. And it's all orchestrated through frequency. I mean, that's the way they discovered that the neutrino had mass. You don't oscillate it. It's in the music. This is the music of the spheres. This is the whole business about the way in which everything is linked. Everything is linked through frequency. That says a lot. Remember that in looking at the nature of the bases and the structure of the mechanical aspect of the biverse, that we see right away that sound and music is the ultimate illusion. It's the ultimate illusion. A mutation is the ultimate illusion. The crystals truly know nothing of the meat. The meat has a way of its own. It has its own evolutionary process. It has its own transition in space. So when we're down here at the tone level, this is how the meat organizes us. And organizes us to be one living thing. We have problems with scale. We've always had problems with scale. That's our vanity. Now we have reversed vanity when we look up into the night sky. We always have this assumption that we're dealing with something vast. By the way, they just discovered that it's pretty flat. It's interesting. But our concept of vastness doesn't really mean very much. And if you take all of us who are participating in the consciousness program on this planet, we're only an aspect of the whole, even as that. And our role in that whole is to be able to guide and direct an evolving form, the biverse itself. So everything about all of us being on earth, and by the way, when I say us, I mean every form of life. But the whole thing about all of us being involved in this process is that we are all linked whether we like it or not. And one of the things that's so essential for humanity is that at the most mundane, at the crudest level, the only way we begin to find our oneness, our wholeness, is in our capacity to be able to communicate to each other. In other words, the gift of being able to mutate sound, mutate the waves in order to be able to initiate language in that sense, in order to be able to initiate our capacity to communicate with each other. And of course, in this day and age, when we have these incredible mediums for communication, that frequency is beginning to do its job. In other words, we're beginning to layer all of consciousness with the same spontaneous, continuing input. It means that every single one of us, the only way in which we connect to the whole is through what we take in acoustically. And our contribution to the whole operates through an entirely different sense. This is one of the things about what it is to be human and it is to be awake. The vast majority of humanity is deaf, and they do not hear what's going on. They don't hear at all. It's like seeing. If you're trying to get someplace and that's the only place that you can look, you see nothing else. When you're trying to hear something, you hear nothing. You miss all the other things that are there to be heard. And of course, one of the things about being awake and being surrendered, which by the way is just mechanical, it's just following your strategy, is that you hear differently. You're not attached to hearing what you think you need to hear or want to hear, and you're not pointing towards a source that you think you're going to get it from. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it is our way of being together. Being open acoustically is part of what people call love. It's one of the deepest needs in romance is to have somebody who will listen to you. Otherwise, there's no way in which you can make that bond. And more relationships are destroyed because somebody's got a deaf ear. They're trying to hear something else, and they're not open to hearing what's really there. That's going to stay there for 2 days, so I guess you can write it down. I didn't make any copies of it. It's probably for me. What are we going to do with that one?
It's acoustic.
It is acoustic. I mean, it could be somebody desperately trying to find out where Lizard Head Hall is. You never know. Yeah, if you just turn down the tone, where's that? Okay. Before we get into the detail of any of this, I want you to look at the division and the way that it's structured. In other words, that you can see that the 6 tones are broken up into 3 specific groups. And that we have moved away from the base, and the moment that you move away from the base, you're moving into the physical design. Remember that the base itself is an orientation. This is all about cognition. And one of the things to see very clearly is that the moment that you move to this level, you start working with the basic structure of the form itself. In other words, you're working at basic levels of chemistry, and they operate through what we know in design as 3 primary centers, centers that are involved in the awareness process. In other words, the spleen, the ajna, and the solar plex. Nothing conditions a human being more than being conditioned through one of the potential awareness centers. You know, in discussions of the way in which the analytical process works, often the example is always limited or only limited to the solar plex. I myself do that quite often because I've been a victim of solar plex conditioning, and I have a defined ajna and spleen, so I don't have that experience. However, it's very important to understand that the way in which we see conditioning take place in these 3 centers is always more dynamic than in any other center. We know very clearly that with the open emotional system, first of all, that these centers are going to reflect, but they're also going to magnify. So we know that with the open emotional system, that if you take in somebody's emotional wave, you're going to reflect that wave, you're going to pump up that wave, you're going to live that energy out. And because the emotions are so volatile, and because this is not a true awareness center, but basically a motor function, this is one of the more destabilizing conditioning elements that we have on the planet. However, you still have very, very deep and profound conditioning in the other true awareness centers. If somebody has an open spleen, you know, people who walk around with an open spleen are always complaining about their lack of well-being. But it's the lack of well-being in the world that they're in. After all, they're as sensitive to the splenic condition of others as an undefined emotional person is to somebody's emotional definition. And they also will reflect and pump that up, magnify it. And so somebody who has an open spleen or somebody that has an open emotional system, they actually end up with very similar problems in life in terms of the way they're being conditioned. And both of them end up with strategies that turn them into people who do not want to deal with confrontation, people who want to back away from that, people who begin to lie to themselves, people who don't share what they can share because they don't want to take the consequences. If you've got a lover who's got a defined spleen, you don't want to get into a fight with that lover, because if your lover walks away, you're going to start feeling terrible. They're going to take away the feel good. It becomes a basic blackmail. This is the kind of thing that is very powerful in undefined awareness centers, and that involves the mind as well, and the mind is the trickiest. After all, the vast majority of humanity thinks that their mind is what's guiding them in this life. It is their assumption that their mind is going to be able to lead them. So if you have somebody with an open mind, you can condition them deeply. I mean deeply. Not only are you conditioning them to whatever your trip happens to be, and it gets magnified in them, but of course then they try to use that as an authority, and that is not going to work for them. So in looking at these 3 centers, because they're going to be so important, you can see that they are a foundation upon which the rest of the structure is built. In other words, these 3 centers are very, very important. Very important in understanding how we operate as a whole, but also our sensitivities in terms of those centers. We're going to start with the splenic the splenic binary, there's always a hierarchy. You can never escape hierarchies. The spleen was first. It was our first awareness. It's our oldest awareness. And it takes care of basic business. Its deepest concern is our survival. So when you're dealing with the splenic binary, that these are the oldest and most developed departments that we have. You can see that if you look at the first and second tones, you see that the quality of them, the sense of them, is smell and taste. Now, of course, knowing design, you can see that this is related to the streams operating through the splenic center, but without the individual. Remember that the acoustic runs through everything. The acoustic is the general medium through which all of this operates. So here in looking at the splenic binary, what you're looking at is smell. This is the 54, 32, 44, 26. And it goes all the way up to the 21 and finally at the 45. Now the whole thing about 45s is that they're always trying to avoid the smell. But that's another story. So the first thing to see is that when you're looking at the binary, you can also see that that binary is going to operate. Now think about what I'm actually telling you. What I'm actually telling you is that, for example, let's say that you have the first tone. The first tone is part of your design. One of the things to recognize about that is that that tone's going to operate more efficiently if it happens to be in that stream, if it happens to be in one of those gates. But if you don't have that, what that's going to mean is that acoustically, you're going to be attracted to those people who will have activation in those gates that you can take into your system. Always remember, we're not alone. It's very complex when you get to this level because there's many, many things going on at the same time. And it's through the acoustics that we find our necessary companions. After all, some of us have to put out a specific tone in a specific place. Others have to take in the tone. It's always like that. We have all these locks and keys that are operating. Remember, there is a deep connection here from tone to color, which means that the structure that's laid here at the tone level goes into what later you see as your design. In other words, you're going to be able to read back to this place. It doesn't mean you get the contact with it within your being. Remember that most of us are always going to be limited to motive. When you see your motivations, you will immediately recognize them. In other words, color is something that once it's there for you to see, you will recognize it. But not necessarily tone in the sense that you can really feel that or the essence of that within you, because by the time you get to color, it's personalized. See, that's the difference between tone and color. You know, tone is there to integrate into the whole, but to set a platform for the personal experience. So there's a bridging that's taking place here between tone and color, and that bridging can be seen in the design where it's impacting in the physical design itself. One of the things you'll notice, because I will take you through that, is that each and every one of the gates are different as subtleties. In other words, these are vast departments that are broken up into little sub-departments. Okay, so you've got all the 54 beings as an example. And all those 54s that are first tone, you know, the whole world of ambition is driven by them. I mean, they are the archetype of what ambition really is. You know, they're going to bring that, and they're going to bring that out as a generalized theme. And of course, there's others who are going to take that in. There are others who are going to be conditioned by that, and out of that, they set a tone for the whole. Again, remember, all of this is about making sure that everybody's in the movie and that everybody's playing their part and nobody knows what it is, so it's all going on without them being aware of it, and everybody walks around being fucked up. I mean, it's always so amazing to me, people with their lives, eh? I mean, if you're really serious after this week, drop dead. I mean, give me a fucking break, Anyway, okay. So when we start with what is prime. We start with the most important thing of all. We start with security. See? We have to keep this in. People think that it's the Matrix. Nothing's more important than security. It's where everything starts. It is truly the beginning of the process. This is the whole thing about being in flesh. We have to see that it's always the priority, that the mechanism itself looks after itself. I mean, think about what it would be like. I mean, really, think about it. People love to say that they have choices. Think about what it would be like if it was your choice to breathe or not. No. I mean, really, think about that for a moment. That you would have to keep on reminding yourself, oh, I got to breathe now. I mean, we would be useless. We would still be mud people. I mean, what are you going to do when you got to spend the whole day thinking about, should I not? It's time. Okay. We're not in charge of all of this. So the first thing to recognize is that security is built into us, and that all of our concepts, philosophies about, peace and this and that, and blah, 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 and all of this stuff. Let us put this all in perspective. That may be very nice, but when you get down to the first thing is security. And it also says to us that this is the oldest department. In other words, when the whole structure began, this is where it started. It started with security first. Now, security means two things. To be secure as a species means that you must have your territory and your food. You must. But it also means that you must be able to defend yourself. After all, we're talking about the human immune system when we're dealing with the splenic center. In other words, that not only must we be able to secure what is ours and have enough to sustain us, but we also have to be prepared to be able to defend that. It's just built into us. And everything about that is about smell. I mean, that's what it's all about. The splenic center is the center of our primary fears. Now, in the stream of smell, that the two fears that are there, the fear of the 32 duration, which is the fear of failure, people always personalize that. Well, you can personalize that at the line level. Because at the line level, it's about whether you're going to be a failure or not, whether you can make it or not, because it becomes personalized at that level. But when you're looking at it from the perspective of the tone, failure is special. In other words, it is the failure to continue. We are so far away in our Maya that we forget that the deepest fear that lies within us is the fear that our species will disappear. There's no deeper fear. The fear of extinction. Everything on this planet gets wiped out. What do we lose? 40 species of something a day or a month or whatever it is now. They're flying out the door, and you've got all these softies who are so dumb, mourning them. They want to clone them and keep them in zoos. They're not supposed to be here. They didn't make it, folks. So one of the deepest fears inside of us as a species is we will not make it. We're at the top of the food chain. It gets real scary when you're at the top of the food chain because you relax. It's like the Roman Empire. You get to the top of the food chain, you relax, the whole thing falls apart. So there is an inner vigilance that is there in the genetic drive to maintain our security. As a matter of fact, as we have become more and more sophisticated in terms of our technology and education, one of the places where we invest the greatest amount of human capital is in keeping us alive and in keeping our immune systems healthy. I mean, we spend billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in order to improve on these mechanisms and keep them cooking. You know, all this business about cloning, in vitro, any of these techniques, we're the first species ever that can go like this to the fates. And people think that's bad. You know, I want to give Earth a Nobel Evolution Prize. Because that's what it's about. You see, our whole drive for security is not complete by getting to the top of the food chain. It isn't. It's only complete when we have the security that we are not going to perish. That we're not going to go down in smoke from some comet like the dinosaurs. That we're not going to be wiped out like some animal that we fed on. We want to make sure that we're going to be able to stay around forever. That's our job. Follow that stream. When you start at the 54, one of the most remarkable things about the 54 is the fourth line, as you know. That fourth line is all about the mystical potential to be recognized. Recognition is everything to the 54th gate. It calls for recognition. It's one of the mythologies of America. The mythology of America is that anybody in the gene pool can climb to the top. Anybody. And that the miraculous thing about that is that by not restricting them through class or race or whatever the case may be, the best possible innovation, the best possible mutation gets a chance to change the society as a whole. It's an essential concept. In other words, you know, the moment that you had regimented educational systems under Marxism. You know, when the state was deciding what kind of educational field would be valid and useful 20 years down the road, an enormous number of talented people were involved in sciences or whatever that truly was not their interest. It did not mean, by the way, that they would be inferior in that. We're all conditioned in the sense that the world is ignorant. However, innovation, mutation would only have come had they been in something that was truly for them in that sense. So it's very important to see that when we're dealing with the nature of security, that part of being able to keep our species alive is not by being fixed on what the attributes we need to survive are going to look like. This is something very important. So the 54 is there to be recognized. My image of that for you always is the person on the shop room floor that somebody is looking down from above and saying, that one's a really good worker. That one has the right attitude. That one can be this or that or whatever. And suddenly they get picked out of the group and groomed and given their opportunity to go up. Now, by the way, just because they get that opportunity doesn't mean that they're useful when they get up there. Anybody carrying the 54 has an opportunity throughout their lives to be recognized in that way, that somebody is ready to pluck them out. But see that not personally, see that as a genetic thing. And the moment you see that genetically, you see the value of that. In other words, that way you're not restricting where things can come from in order to impact ultimately on the tribe. Remember that the numerical joke of the 54 is that at the end of that stream you have the 45. The other way around, where suddenly the worker on the shoproom floor has become the CEO, has become the king, the queen that's sitting at the top of the ladder controlling the territory. And smell. My illustration of looking down, you're smelling them. There's a smell to them. And remember something about being recognized. In order to be recognized as a 54, somebody's got to get close enough to you to smell you. And if you smell like Calvin Klein, they're not really going to know who you are. You know, I have this bugaboo about perfumes and deodorants, and you know, it is a false way of trying to create uniformity. It is a way of hiding. And of course, this is something that's very important. If you're somebody who has strong activations in this stream, you know, your natural smell, you know, that's the thing that is one of your greatest assets. I mean, it's one of your greatest assets because other people are going to take that in. And remember, that's not about the concretized aroma that we're talking about. You know, this is the subtlety of pheromones that your brain doesn't even know you're taking in, but you're taking it in anyway, and you're going through a whole defining process as you're doing that. When you get to the actual first awareness of this stream, and you come to the 32nd gate, and you come to the fear of failure, the 32nd gate is called duration. Think about that genetically. That gate is all about continuity. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the 32-6 is one of the very, very few references to suicide. And you see, the self-destruction of a species is always possible. I mean, it is always possible. And it is built into what failure can really be. And when you look at the 32 in a person and you see it at the mundane level, the way they're operating in their life, you know, you'll see right away that, you know, for them, it's all about the moment that continuity breaks down, they lose their job, their lover walks out the door. That's the moment that everything's a failure. That's the moment that they immediately slide. And of course, they could smell it coming. After all, you know, so when you're dealing with the 32 and you're dealing with this fear of failure, recognize that continuity is more important for security than anything else. In other words, the tribe is terrified by sudden leaps. They're terrified by sudden mutation. It is frightening to them because continuity is what works. I don't know the name of this guy, weird guy, living out on the coast somewhere near Los Angeles. He was one of these people that was in the hula hoop business. You know, the hula hoop, how popular it was at a certain time. I don't know, the 50s, I guess. And of course, like so many fads, you know, it was the color of the month for a lot of months and then it disappeared. And, you know, here's somebody that refused to give up. You know, they kept on holding on to their hula hoops. And I remember the story that the guy was paying a fortune to have these things stored in some huge warehouse somewhere where there's millions and millions and millions of these hoops. You know, the moment that you have somebody who has the 32 and they're involved in something, you know, humanity works this way, and suddenly there's a change, it's not easy for them. I mean, they get very, very depressed. They lose the continuity. They think they're going to be a failure because the whole thing is that trends do change. How many tribes on this planet now are in desperate trouble in terms of their cultural allegiance because of the collective impact of collective culture on them? It's breaking the continuity. And breaking the continuity represents a deep fear. I have mentioned this several times over the years, that in order to have political stability on this planet, every single cultural group has to be able to have the integrity of their own territory, their own language, and their own education. Otherwise, you're never, ever, ever going to have peace. Because the tribe needs to have continuity, and as long as it's allowed to have its, you know, Ukrainian club or Greek club or whatever the case may be, as long as it's able to hold on to some aspect of the continuity of its genetic line, then it's going to be able to integrate into the whole. So in moving through this smell, when you get to the 32, this smell of failure, this fear, is always the fear that the continuity is going to break down. We live in a time in which that fear is part of the modern American landscape. Here you have the breakup of the traditional family. America today, maybe you have 4% that are 3-generational families. It's basically gone. In other words, there has been a transition that's taken place, and that transition has been disturbing in terms of the continuity of the culture. And there's a lot of people who get very upset. They get very upset because they think that their culture is dying. And of course, out of that, you have the roots of fundamentalism. In other words, you have a fundamental reaction. You have all of these old faiths that are now going to the hardest line they can find because everything is dissolving around them. You can't take away anybody's God. It's just not possible. What you can do is show them that we're all talking about the same thing. I don't care what anybody believes. It doesn't make a difference to me. I don't care what faith. Human design has nothing to do with any of that. All of that comes out of human design. And anybody who has studied human design knows that you can find the roots of every religion, of every faith, of every cult, of every piece of nonsense that has ever been put out on this planet and stuck into the Maya. You cannot take those things away because you threaten the tribe at its deepest level, because what you're actually threatening is their genetic line. Think about that. That's actually what you're threatening. You're threatening that their contribution to the genetic pool is going to be squeezed off and die out. And even though it makes sense for us in this world today to integrate and all of those things, the genes are still holding on. They don't know what's going on up here. They're holding on for dear life. So it's one of those things we have to understand politically. We have to allow everyone that right, but not that right as a division amongst us, but that right as a color on the palette. The 32 leads to the 44. And the 44 coming to meet is one of the 4 ways. And the thing to recognize about this way, because it is the prime way, it's the fear of the past. It is the fear of extinction. And the 44th gate has a particular skill, if you will, in smelling. It has a particular gift of being able to smell trouble or a rat or whatever the case may be, however we incorporate that into our language. Now, the whole thing about the 44th gate is that the tribe can't do anything without its ego. And the tribe is the only stream that recognizes that by working together, everyone gains. This is the whole closeness of the tribe. It's the way it locks the tribe into its deep, supportive bond. Now, the whole thing about the 44 is that the 44 is never, ever personal. And when it becomes personal, that's when it really becomes a problem. Because the whole thing about the 44 is that its goal is to assure the survival of the species by making sure it has the right kind of ego doing the work. It recognizes that it cannot do it alone. Not possible. And it recognizes that the tribe is only going to be able to survive when it has the willpower to do so. So everything about the 44 is about its capacity to be able to see whether there's still enough will out there. Remember, I'm talking at the genetic level now. See, the moment there's not enough will, that's when the 44 starts getting depressed. Oh my God, we're going to die now. We're not going to make it. There you are in the factory. There you are with all your wonderful products, and all your salesmen are on a junket in LA and they're supposed to be working, whatever the case may be. There's this sudden panic. We're not going to make it. We're not going to survive. We're not going to be able to sell the product. We're not going to have access to the willpower. And of course, the ego is not aware. And when you're looking at the 26th gate, you're looking at a gate of denial. In the biology, in the way in which human form evolves, one of the most important steps in the stages of conception is the stage in which the ego, after being connected to the G center through the channel of initiation, it then goes downwards to the 44 and hooks up the spleen. That's what they actually look like. Okay, these are birds, reptiles, fish. The reason I'm showing you this, every single form of life has a cross-special connection. Has a cross-special connection in this case that if you're looking at birds, reptile, and fish, their cross-special connection is only to humanity. And the way they cross over is that they go from the 44 to the 26. Now, one of the things about the relationship between the 44 and the 26 is something very important. It's the difference between warm-bloodedness and cold-bloodedness. So one of the major attributes or the major impact of the ego is that it is the ego that actually establishes the temperature of the tribe. Now, if the temperature stays cool, nothing starts to stink. You know, but when things heat up, you know, it can really begin to reek. Now, one of the things about this relationship, of course, is that the 44 is basically cold-blooded. It's cold-blooded, and its basic concern is not personal. Remember, I told you this is not a personal gate, and it's one of the most difficult things for somebody who lives the 44 as part of their design not to get caught up in that personally, because you're always looking at the ego that always identifies personally. And so it can be very difficult to avoid that, but basically it is cold-blooded. What it's there for is for the cold-blooded calculation of what it takes to survive. And what it takes to be able to deal with the hot or potentially hot ego at the other end. The 44 is always trying to cool the 26 down. Now, if you're somebody like me who happens to be an ego manifestor and has a 26 gate, can I get hot? I mean, real hot. You know, in the physical sense, as a child with fevers, in terms of the fact that I'm a manifestor, then I carry manifestor's anger. I don't just get angry. I get hot angry. You know, it's like a fire. That's the 26. Now the 44 is like a cool well. And of course there's this that takes place. But the whole thing about that is that it is this balance. And of course this balance is telling us something about the tribe itself. Tribes are either hot or cold. The tribe can be really cool. You know, the Slovenes. Really cool. Tribe can be hot. You know, you can have the Croats and the Serbs, and then you get a lot of blood spilt. And it's always there. It's a temperature thing. And the whole thing about that temperature is when everything's cool, nothing stinks. You know, imagine how much more peaceful, or pardon me, let's do it the other way. Imagine what Phoenix would be like if they turned off the air conditioning for the next 3 weeks. How many more people would be killed? How many more neighbors would be fighting each other? Why do you have to cook that every night? You know. See, everything that takes place at the genetic level, at our deep chemistry, we live out as larger metaphors in the Maya. It's always there. Those things are all around us. So when you're dealing with this question of security, and you're dealing with the 44, the whole thing about the 44 is the 44 wants to stay cool, but it doesn't want to be frozen out. It doesn't want to be cut out of the game. It doesn't want to be cut out of anything. It doesn't want to be left to the side. It doesn't want to go the way of other cold-blooded creatures that are constantly dependent on their environment. You see, the most important thing that the ego has done for humanity, it's the ego that created architecture. Out of that architecture comes this whole sheltering business. And of course, the sheltering business has made the biggest difference in the way in which we've developed. After all, we can live anywhere. We can live in the middle of the desert. We can live in the high Arctic. We can live anywhere because we know how to create environments around us. And that's the work of the ego that builds the temples. My house is warmer than your house. Where I live in Spain, that's a big question. Eh? You live on a Mediterranean island, nobody ever thinks about heating. In the wintertime, everybody is concerned. The ego in life, it is the ego that's always building these environments to make it possible for us to be able to survive, to be able to flourish regardless of what kind of environment we're in. So the security is that the 44 wants to be taken out of the cold. It wants to be brought into the shelter that the 26 can create. And of course, the 26 is sitting back there with its hand outstretched, saying, what, me? Work for you? Work for the tribe? Blah, 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 blah. Who, me? I'm everything, blah, 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 blah. So there is an intrinsic bargain in that. Now, the bargain in that is that the 44 recognizes that it needs to be able to allow the 26 to run at least relatively hot, otherwise nothing gets done. In order for it to get what it needs, and in return what it does is that it gives the 26 access to what it wants the most, free time. That's the deal. That's the whole deal. As long as the 26 can get its free time, it's always going to be ready to make some kind of bargain with the 44. Now, the 26 has a different kind of smell. After all, this is the egoist. And this is the gate of the trickster. This is a gate of great manipulation. After all, it is the taming power of the great. And what it can tame is that it can tame the memory. It can smell a sucker a mile away. It can smell somebody that's open to a story. It can smell it. It's there. Remember, it is the job of the 26 to complete this process of transmission. And everything about security is about transmission. See, at the genetic level, everybody has to be coordinated on the same team, know who the enemy is, be protected. It's tribal. They all got to do that together. And remember, the most important thing about the tribe is that everybody has to eat the same food in order to smell the same. Now, you can't do that unless you enclose people. You can't. You have to bring them into an environment. So you bring them into a closed village. The village itself becomes an aroma field. And it's an aroma field that has the same basic diet. Nobody in that village is going to be able to get away with having a totally different diet than everybody else. First of all, they won't be able to go into the local shop and find it. Because the moment you change the diet, you change the aroma, you no longer belong in the tribe. So the gift of the 26 is that in order for it to be able to get the message across, to be able to sell the product as an example, what it does is it creates the enclosure. See, this is the whole thing about the ego. The ego is always trying to build a wall around everything. It builds a wall around everything, and then everything is easy to access. So it built the first walled city. Out of that, you got the first bureaucracy. You got the first people with free time. They didn't have to work in the fields. They could just sit around in the temples and count. And all they had to do was put a lot of effort into building those walls. Everything was fine. Then they have a captured audience. I mean, that's what the 26 likes best of all. That's why the tribe, if you introduce something to the tribe and it's a 26 that brings it into the tribe, everybody in the tribe sooner or later has to do it. Because if everybody isn't doing it, then you're not a tribe anymore. You know, you go into certain villages and everybody's got the same model car. I mean, even if you're going for outrageous color, you might be in trouble. You know? You don't belong to the same tribe. You can see that in New York City. You got the same cabs, you got the same look, police cars, you know, you name it. You know, we're always identifying our tribes. And we do that by giving them a structure, by closing them in. And of course, this is the work of the ego. Remember, the ego does all the work for the tribe. And because they do all the work, they demand the perks. They demand rewards. Now, if the structure is fair, nobody minds. In other words, that the workers in the factory who are making $15 an hour don't mind that the salesman is making a fortune, that he's playing golf 3 days a week, as long as they can keep their jobs and the factory doesn't close down. I mean, after all, there's always a hierarchy. You know, but the moment that you've got an executive that's taking millions of dollars and you got a company that's going bankrupt, you're going to have a lot of people very upset. The hot-bloodedness. Everything about the tribe is about keeping the temperature moderate. Everything. It's so important. And it means the same thing about us and our bodies. You know, if you look very carefully and you see where the development of the greatest intellectual stuff that's taken place in this world, it's not in extreme climates. It's not where there is all this pressure to have, you know, artificial climates and enclosures in order to make everything work. In other words, it's climates that are relatively comfortable for us to stay moderate in them. We're always telling people to cool down. You know, I mean, and in my era, it was very hip to say that you were cool, you know. And it's one of the things to understand that that's a very, very important ingredient. So when somebody's around you and they're hot, it is threatening. And it's threatening to security. When you get to the 21, you get to that ego quality in which the ego is in absolute control. And that unless the ego is in control, security is not possible. In other words, the moment that we build enclosures, we created police. And we can't do without them. That's why we have them, whether we like them or not. We don't treat them very well, however. Fact is that this is the nature of the tribe, is that the tribe has to be kept in line. It's just in the genes. It's nothing personal. And it's kept in line in terms of three things, and these three things that I always associate with the 21st gate, please recognize that these three themes are the three basic themes of security. Where you live, your territory. What you wear, your costume. And what you eat, your diet. Now, those are the three things that hold a tribe together. I see that a number of American cities have just passed laws in which students are going to be forced to wear uniforms again, have uniformity in the classroom. And of course, this traditional argument that goes on both sides about whether that's a value or not. But just in terms of genetics, you know, when we're in the same costume, we belong to the same club. I mean, you know, I can remember the 60s where if you had jeans and long hair, you all belonged to the same club. You know, it's just the way that it was. You know, that was tribal. It is a way in which we bond. And of course, it gives you a kind of amusing insight into what the fashion industry really is. But that's another story. So one of the things to understand about the nature of the genetics as it operates is that the 21 in its what appears to be its personal life, bossing you around, telling you what to do, telling you what to wear, all of those things, is that what they're really doing is they're trying to hold the tribe together. I mean, that's what they're really doing. They're trying to hold the tribe together. And of course, as long as everybody is following along with that, there is this sense of security that's there. I mean, for example, if you're a poor child in a middle-class school neighborhood where you've got children who are very well dressed, who change their clothes every day, blah, 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 all of that stuff, and you're poor, it's nice not to have to go through the inadequacy and the discomfort of that because children are cruel. There are aspects to that are valid. You are somebody who can fit in automatically because it's not simply the way that you're seen. And of course, this is the whole thing about the tribe. The tribe doesn't want anybody to stand out because then everybody fits in. All my sannyasin friends, when I first met them, it was this one large orange blob. And it was really hard to see any differentiation in all of that. It was just blobs everywhere. And you could tell they were a tribe. And of course, that gave them a bond. If they saw somebody in orange, instantaneously, that was somebody they could bond with. So we have these strong things when it comes to that. So you have to see that this is one of the basic ways in which we're secure. Now, for me, the ultimate costume is your body graph. I mean, to me, that's the costume. And if everybody lives that costume the way it's meant to be lived, everything's fine. Because nobody is going to see the superficiality of the difference. They're going to meet the human being. They're going to meet the person that's there that's very different. But think about what it's like when the 21s are not listened to. When the children of the tribe refuse to dress like their parents. I mean, living so long as I have in Spain, one of the oldest Catholic traditions in Spain is that once a woman has menstruated, if anybody in her family dies, if any male in her family dies, she wears black for the rest of her life. It's called de luto. Now, I mean, I have no objection to that. I rather like black. However, that's a terrible imposition to put on a 16-year-old girl who wants to, feel the color and whatever. And of course, the fact of the matter is that because of the globalization and the way in which culture infects different lives, you don't see that anymore in Spain. You don't see young women in black. You may see their mothers or grandmothers, their grandmothers all in black, but not necessarily so. There is a threat to the culture. They're losing their children. And remember that fear of security creates reactions in other ways. People holding on to old things that may not work anymore. And people truly just out of ignorance not seeing that that's not what it's about. It's about seeing your children for who they are and seeing their world for what it is. You see, because the moment that you alienate your children because your children wear a different costume, they will end up abandoning your culture. I mean, they will. And remember, you can't do that. It's not healthy. It's not healthy to forget those roots. Genetically, it is very unhealthy because it leads to fear. The further away you move from your roots, the more fear is being generated. You got to take your roots with you. Wherever you go. It's important because it keeps the genes cool. But the moment that you're not taking your roots with you, the moment that you're hiding your background, your culture, whatever, and there's so many, North America, we all grew up in an immigrant culture. I know how many friends of mine, and when I was growing up, who really didn't let you see what was behind that. They wanted to forget all that. That wasn't theirs. That was their parents. They didn't want to learn the language of their parents. They didn't want any of that. And it was very commonplace. After all, the North American society is designed to homogenize people as quickly as possible. I was more fortunate in Canada in that Canada has a different relationship to the multicultural, and everybody is sort of hyphenated. You're an Italian Canadian or you're a German Canadian. But it's something important to recognize that the holding on of the root isn't a philosophy question. It's a genetic question. It's actually going to keep you cooler. You know, since I moved away from Europe, my son has stopped speaking his second language and only understands it and hears it. And you know, I know that's unhealthy for him. You know, I know that the moment he goes back and he starts using another language again, part of his root, you know, then he's going to be much more at peace within himself, even though it's operating a level he doesn't have touch with. Remember, tone level, you don't have any, you can't get to it. So again, the moment to see is that, you know, there are certain things at the surface level, if you let go of, that makes everything quieter down below, because this is all about basic security, and particularly if you're somebody who carries a first tone in your design, in your profile. Remember now, you're going to have many tones in your design, obviously, for all your lines. So that means that you're going to be able to look at that tonal level down to the line level. And where you see those first tones, you're going to have to see that deep underneath that is a real need for security. And that all the fears that can come out of that.